I'm Frederick. They told me this in a whisper. Now, you'll hear it. Enjoy watching. The day began like any other, lazily, quietly, with a grey sky hanging over the streets like a blanket too heavy for a spring morning. In the residential area on the outskirts of the city, everything seemed painfully ordinary. Cars were parked along the curbs, the windows of the apartment buildings were still half closed. Someone was just starting to make coffee. Someone was trying to drag a child to school. But in this viscous, grey routine, there was something hidden, something that could not be explained, only felt. There was a tension in the air, barely perceptible, like a metallic taste on the tongue before a thunderstorm. Jerome West walked along a familiar path near the park, his old army jacket slightly dangling on his thin body, and in his right hand he held the leash. His faithful dog named King led him forward, sniffing every patch of ground, as if searching for something important. Jerome walked slowly, deliberately. He was a man who had learned to live in the rhythm of silence, the silence that comes after a gunshot, the silence that lingers in your ears after an explosion. He had 2 tours of duty behind him, lost friends, the crumpled gratitude of a country, and a life where every morning was a small victory over despair. He did not complain. He breathed. He simply was. And today, like yesterday, he just wanted to take King for a walk, go home, turn on the old radio, heat up a can of fish. He did not know that in a matter of minutes he would be lying face down in the dust, blood on his lips, silence in his eyes. In the distance, around the bend in the street, a police cruiser was already moving. Officer Jackson Rales sat inside, a man with a face that seemed forever etched with malice. His eyes never sought justice, they sought purpose. He had grown up in this same neighborhood, but he had always thought there were too many noisy faces, too many strangers. He didn't see the warrior in Jerome, didn't notice the grey hair at his temples or the old combat boots. He saw only the silhouette of a black man with a dog. He was in a bad mood. He had a reason. For people like Jackson, Jerome had once gone to war, and now he was a stranger to them, suspicious, unnecessary. A teenager on a skateboard, wearing headphones, passed by, not noticing either the police car or Jerome. Time seemed to slow down. The patrol car stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. The door opened sharply, with an annoying metallic screech, as if a gun had been pulled from a holster. Jackson got out without turning on the siren, without giving any commands. He simply approached. His boots pressed loudly into the gravel at the side of the road. Jerome stopped, turning slowly, instinctively placing King between himself and the officer. The dog was alert, ears pricked, tail raised. "Hey!" a voice sounded sharp as a whip. "What are you doing here, buddy?" Jerome's gaze was calm, tired. He didn't answer, only nodded slightly. "Out for a walk," he said quietly, as if afraid to scare away the fragile balance on which this day rested. "Out for a walk, huh?" The officer stepped closer, his gaze sliding over King. "There have already been complaints on this street about a suspicious man with a dog, and you fit the description perfectly." Jerome couldn't believe his ears. He knew how this world worked, but he still hoped that today maybe would be okay. "I live here," he said shortly. "On Ridge Avenue." "Yeah," the cop grinned. "Of course, and you might as well tell me you're a veteran. Shut up and don't move." Jackson's voice grew louder, cuttingly sharp. He came too close, and King growled quietly. Without thinking twice, Jackson jerked the leash and pushed the dog away with fury. King's body flew to the side, hit a metal trash can, cracking, whining. Jerome jerked forward, but was pushed in the chest. He stumbled, did not fall, but already understood everything. There was not a grain of doubt in the cop's eyes, not a grain of doubt in his own rightness. This was the moment when everything became clear. Today is not just a morning. Today is a hunt. The air trembled with tension. People in the windows began to move. Phones floated in their hands like weapons of resistance, but no one was in a hurry to intervene. No one wanted to be next. Jerome looked at King again. The dog was breathing, but his paws were bent, and his muzzle was in the dust. And at that moment, he understood. He could not remain silent any longer, but to take a step meant challenging not a person, but the entire system that he personified. And yet, Jerome took it. One step forward, one breath, one word. You crossed the line. Oh, really? Jackson chuckled, reaching for his handcuffs. And you, my friend, just gave me a reason. But before he could put his hands out, a voice spoke. Female, hard, cold. Officer Rails, stop that right now. Both men froze. Behind the cop stood a woman in civilian clothes, a badge dangling from her neck. She was already recording everything on camera. And her voice wasn't just a voice, it was a death sentence. Jackson turned around, and for a split second, fear flashed in his eyes. The kind you can't fake. The kind that comes when you suddenly realize you're no longer the hunter. You're the hunted. He stood still, as he had at hundreds of other times in his life, when his heart was pounding and his face had to remain stony. War taught you not to feel, not to show, not to twitch. And he still lived by those rules, even on his own soil, even at home, which had long ceased to feel like home. The woman with the badge continued to speak, her voice filled with authority, but Jerome barely heard the words. His eyes were fixed on King. The dog was trying to get up, tucking his back leg under him, his breathing hoarse, his chest heaving. The sound reminded Jerome of those nights in the desert when friends died next to him, gasping for air, and you could do nothing to help. His fingers clenched into fists. As Jackson slowly began to turn toward the woman, she pulled out her ID and showed it so that there was no doubt. The Federal Civil Rights Attorney's office. Jerome could feel the crowd stirring behind him. People taking pictures, whispering, but not as indifferently. Not with the same distance as before. There was no joy in Jerome's eyes. Only weariness. He knew that even if justice spoke today, tomorrow it could all start over again. He knew this because he had been through all this before, only under the flag, in a different uniform, on foreign soil. His name was Sergeant West. Back then, he wore a flak jacket, not a shabby jacket. He had a platoon, not a dog. He was respected. People obeyed him. In Iraq, he pulled guys out of burning Humvees. In Afghanistan, he lost 2 of his best friends in the same ambush. For this, he was given a medal, which he wore only once, at a ceremony where everyone smiled, shook hands, and said, "We are proud of you," and then just disappeared. Everything disappeared with them. Housing, promises, work, medicine. When he returned to the States, it was as if the system had closed the door on him. He was a nobody. Veterans like him did not fit the picture of a true patriot. Too many scars, too little white skin. He went to a military hospital. They put him on the list for an examination in 4 months. He knocked on the administration about housing. They put him at the end of the list. At the labor exchange, they told him, "With a resume like that, you can only work as a security guard at a supermarket." And even there, they did not hire. He tried to get a job as a bus driver, but during the interview, the manager looked at him, at his hands, at the old tattoo on his neck, and everything became clear without words. "Call us later." He did not call. He slept in a homeless shelter, then in a car until it broke down, then on the street. King somehow showed up on his own. At first he just followed him, then lay down next to him. None of them needed pity, only silence. Together they became a family, the one that had been taken from Jerome. The neighborhood he now lived in wasn't the best, but it was tolerable, as long as you kept quiet, didn't show your teeth, didn't push yourself. But being a black veteran was enough to make you suspicious. He was seen as a passerby, as part of the background. And yet, as a threat. People glanced at each other when he walked into the grocery store. The cashier put his change on the counter instead of in his hand. The old men at the entrance whispered, "That guy with the dog is weird." He was among his own, and yet an outsider. When he once tried to talk to the local priest, he nodded, listened, and then said, "Pray, brother. God will not abandon you." But Jerome had long felt that God had turned away, or maybe he was just tired. In the evenings, he sat on the same park bench where they had tried to arrest him today and watched the setting sun turn the streets gold. He thought about those who had never returned, about the friends with silly nicknames and real dreams. They were all dead, and he lived. And every day that fact seemed like a mockery. When Jackson had approached him today, he had felt not fear, but indifference, as if he had already known. Sooner or later, this would happen. His skin color was his curse. He didn't have to do anything to become a target. All he had to do was breathe. After meeting Jackson, after the federal agent had ordered the arrest to end, the officer tried to justify himself. That suspicious behavior, that complaints, that a threat to public order. But the camera was already recording, and no one believed the words anymore. They had heard it too many times. And Jerome stood and looked, not at the cop, not at the woman, at King. He leaned down and picked the dog up, despite the weight. His hands were shaking, but he held on tight. The woman came up to him and introduced herself, asked how he was feeling. He didn't answer. He just nodded. His voice seemed to be somewhere deep inside, buried along with the medal he'd long since hidden in a shoebox. She offered to help. Medical, legal, psychological. He nodded again. But there was emptiness in his eyes. His name had meant something when it was embroidered on his bulletproof vest. Now it was just a line in an archive. A name forgotten. A name erased. Jerome West. Soldier. Veteran. Human. But on the streets, where skin color mattered more than heroism, he was just black and a dog. A potential threat. An ordinary target. And even if someone saw more today, he knew that tomorrow the system would start again from scratch, and his name would not be on that page. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever had a similar incident in your life? An encounter with injustice, bias, or indifference? We read every comment. Subscribe if you want to hear even more stories that touch the depths of your soul. And now let's continue. The bench Jerome sat on was old, with peeling paint and knife-cut names of people no one remembered anymore. It was his refuge, not because it was comfortable, but because it was familiar. Every time he sat there, he knew that he could, if only for a moment, be invisible. To everyone, to the world, to the pain. But not this time. A patrol car appeared silently, like a ghost, gliding along the asphalt, its headlights off, a shadow behind the glass. At the wheel was Jackson Rails, a man whose name was known informally in the neighborhood, in whispers, in glances. He was not new, and he was not a stranger. He was someone who was feared by his own. He was invited to lecture children in schools about law and order, but those who encountered him after dark knew the other side of the coin. There was no desire in his eyes to protect, only to judge. He believed that the city was rotten, and he was the only one who could cut out the rot. Only the rot, to him, was usually people like Jerome. When he saw him on the bench, his face did not move, did not change, did not frown, just froze in the expression he wore like a mask: contempt. In that moment, he did not see a veteran, did not see a person. He saw the silhouette of a black man, sitting alone, with a dog, in the wrong clothes, in the wrong place. That was enough. Enough to turn on the mechanisms of his mind, old as mold. He stopped the car, got out abruptly, as if he had received an alarm, as if he were facing a dangerous criminal and not a man simply trying to survive. Jerome looked up, not immediately, but in the way warriors do, with an internal check. Is it necessary to look at all? He saw the uniform, he saw the face, and he knew, this is not an identification check, this is a hunt. Jackson walked quickly, his steps hard, each one saying, "I have already decided who you are to me." "Get up," he ordered. No reason, no justification, just get up. Jerome didn't move. He just said quietly, "This is a public bench. I'm just resting." "I said get up," Rails repeated, closer. He was standing directly above him now, like an executioner with his axe already raised, just waiting for you to tire of resisting. "Or do you want me to use force?" The question was rhetorical. He didn't care for the answer. His gaze fell on King, who lay quietly, his ear pressed back, but his body was tense, like a taut string. He felt threatened. Jackson made no secret of his disgust. He wanted Jerome to be afraid. He wanted to see humiliation. It was his fuel. "Documents," he snapped. Jerome silently held out his veteran's identification. Rails took it, glanced at it, and tossed it to the ground without looking. "That doesn't make you immune," he said. "I've gotten complaints. Your dog barks. You scare the kids." Jerome looked into his eyes. No fear, no anger, just a silence that asked, "Are you serious?" But that silence only made the cop angrier. "You think you can get away with anything just because you served," he hissed. "We all serve. Just me every day. I protect the streets from guys like you, guys like him." He nodded at King. Jerome stood up. Slowly, calmly, he picked up the badge. "I've protected guys like you, even when you didn't deserve it." "Oh, really?" Rails chuckled. "Then act like a soldier, not a street urchin." His hand touched the nightstick. His fingers moved around the handle. It was a warning, or maybe an invitation. All it would take was one move, one countermove, and he would have crossed the line. Jerome knew it. And he didn't move. He just stood there and watched. But even that was too much. "Get that dog out of here," Rails said. "Or I will." King stood up, growling softly. Jackson took a step, grabbed the leash, and yanked furiously. The dog yelped, hit the pavement, and immediately tried to rise, but his leg gave way. Jerome lunged forward, but was immediately slammed hard into his chest. He barely stayed on his feet. "You attacked the officer," Rails barked. "Now you're in trouble for real." This whole thing had been a dirty play. A game in which he had already designated an enemy. Jerome knew that any reaction he made would be an excuse for another blow, but he couldn't just stand there any longer. He leaned toward King, holding him close, checking to see if he was all right. The man was breathing hard, his ears down, his tail between his legs. This wasn't just any dog. This was the last one left. Rails pulled out the handcuffs. "On your knees, hands behind your head, last chance." Jerome stood up, his eyes different now. Not anger, not fear, only pain. He'd been on his knees before the flag, before God, before death, but he wouldn't kneel before this man. And that's when a voice rang out, a woman's, cold, commanding. "Officer Rails, stand down. We're under surveillance." She had a camera in her hand, an ID around her neck, and a name he couldn't hear, but which sounded like an alarm. Jackson turned around, and for the first time, he retreated. Not a step, but inside. Everything had changed. The crowd around him wasn't just watching anymore. People were filming. There were shouts. And now, all of this wasn't just a scene. It was proof. But Jerome didn't feel relief, only bitterness. This wasn't the first time. And if it didn't happen now, it would happen tomorrow. He lowered his head. He pressed King to his chest. And he knew he had won this fight. But the war was still going on. Он уже слышал это слово много раз, в разных интонациях, с разной силой, от разных людей, в армии, на гражданке, на улице, в супермаркетах, в кабинетах, даже от тех, кто улыбался до этого, как будто в каждом белозубом приятного дня пряталась готовность вот-вот обнажить ненависть, как нож. Но когда это слово раздалось сейчас, в самое лицо, с чужой безжалостной гортанью, усиленной звуком металла на поясе и тяжелыми шагами на асфальте, оно прозвучало не как оскорбление, а как приговор. «Вставай, нигер, тут не место для таких!» — выкрикнул Джексон Рейлс. Голос его прорезал воздух, как сирена, как команда к началу охоты. Это было не заявление, это был сигнал. Джером поднял голову, очень медленно, как будто каждая секунда давала шанс этому моменту исчезнуть, рассыпаться, стать ошибкой слуха. But he saw everything he needed to see. A face twisted with contempt, eyes that held no doubts or hesitation, only the certainty of impunity. And also, the shadow of a smile. Light, short, but real. Jerome rose slowly, looking straight into his eyes, not defiantly, not aggressively, just with the expression he often had before a fight, as if he already knew what would happen next. And this knowledge brought neither fear nor peace, just the need to go through another fight. He did not want this. He did not ask. He just sat. But it was enough. Sounds began to gather around him. Windows opened. A door creaked somewhere. Leaves rustled on the trees, their calm in sharp contrast to how heavily King began to breathe, standing next to him, ready to protect. The dog did not growl, but his posture said he understood everything, and at that very second, an avalanche began. Jackson stood up, grabbed Jerome by the shoulder and jerked it, as if he wanted to knock out something more than just a balance. I didn't say it, but he was shouting, and his scream was addressed not only to Jerome, but to everyone who watched, to everyone who heard him. He could, King once, clearly, and got a boat, crashed into the urn and whispered a step. But the officer has already taken off the baton, but no one moved. They saw him pushed, insulted, his dog kicked, and nothing. The silence was louder than a scream. Jerome watched them, the eyes that hid, the faces that turned away. He saw the woman with the child pull him aside. He saw the old man at the stand pretend it didn't concern him. He had seen it all before, more than once. Because being a black veteran is not a privilege, it's a burden. They don't see you as a warrior. They don't see you as a person. They see color and everything that comes with it. I'm not fighting back, he said quietly. I was just sitting there. Don't you dare talk to me, Rails shouted. You're nobody here, understand? Nobody. Jerome didn't answer, because he knew every word he said would be used against him. He stood there like a target, and he felt the anger flaring inside him. Not anger, not fury, and the quiet, thick anger that made his fingers go numb and his jaw clench. He remembered watching the back of a white guy named Bennett in the Kandahar Valley. He remembered pulling Sergeant Crowley out from under fire, who couldn't even remember his name. He remembered listening to the commander say at the ceremony, "We're proud of our soldiers." He said it while looking away, and then there it was, his home street, his hometown, and a white cop yelling, "Get up, nigger!" A cop who didn't even try to make an excuse. A cop who wanted nothing more than to humiliate him, to break him, to bring him to his knees. "Is the dog still alive?" a voice said. Someone passing by. A young man. Jackson turned. "Move away. This is a police operation." "He just hit the dog," someone else said. "That's a violation." "Move away, I said." The cop pulled out a can of pepper spray. "Or do you want trouble, smart guy?" And the crowd froze. Because they knew he would do it. Because they knew a complaint wouldn't change anything. Because they knew he was in uniform. And uniform gives you the right. And then Jerome said, "I don't care who you are. You have no right." His voice was low even, not like a threat, like a fact, like the truth. Jackson lunged forward, the baton rose into the air, and at that moment, something clicked. Not a sound, but inside, like glass cracking. People started filming, louder, closer. The cameras came closer, and at that moment, Jackson froze. Because he saw he was no longer in control of the scene. He saw eyes, lots of eyes. People didn't move away. People were filming, and someone was already calling. He heard, "Yes, it's Rails, at the park. He's again." And he realized his name was already being called, already recorded, already on the air. He lowered the baton, but there was fury in his face. "You think they'll save you?" he hissed. "You think you matter?" "No," Jerome said. "But I'm not leaving, and that's what you want more than anything. So you want to die? I want someone to finally see what's happening, even if it means I have to die." They stood in silence. Only the wind, only King's heavy breathing, only the cameras, only the looks. In that moment, time shrank, and the whole world shrank to this street, to this intersection, to this word, "Get up." That was no longer an order. It was a symbol now, a beginning, a reckoning. King didn't know what to do. He was just a dog, a loyal friend, devoted like no other. He didn't know how to fight this man in uniform, this one who challenged their little world of two people and loyalty, nothing more. But he knew one thing, his master was in danger, and if he could help, he had to help. King pulled on his leash, growling a low, menacing growl, trying to get between Jerome and the policeman. His eyes weren't full of fear, only determination. He wasn't a warrior, he was a friend. But to Jerome, he was everything, all he had left. Dogs couldn't talk, couldn't be heroes, but in that moment, King was everything Jerome would have lost if he weren't there. When Jackson took a step toward Jerome, King immediately jumped into action, trying to block the way. His tail was up, his ears were alert, his paws planted firmly on the ground. It was a desperate gesture, because the dog knew that if Jerome was humiliated, he would not be left with the slightest chance. But instead of retreating, Jackson bared his teeth. His face was covered with rage. This was not just an insult. This was evil that did not hide its face. He did not try to dissuade the dog. He did not try to talk. He was ready to break everything that stood in his way. And King became the first obstacle. "Get your dog away," Jackson said, taking a step forward, and his voice became sharp as a knife blade. "Or I will do it for you." King did not retreat. He knew that his master could not defend himself without him. He was not trained to attack, but he was ready to defend. And for Jerome, this was everything. "King!" Jerome shouted, trying to calm the dog, but everything was already decided. Jackson did not wait for him to calm his friend. He grabbed the leash, not giving King any room to maneuver, and he yanked him aside with brutal force. It would have been a perfect trap. The dog lost his balance. He yelped as his body hit the ground, and the moment his hind legs tried to stand up again seemed too long. In that moment, Jerome felt his chest tighten. Everything inside him seemed to freeze, and his consciousness was consumed by one thought. This was not supposed to be happening. This was not supposed to be his world. He saw King stand up, trying to catch his breath, breathing heavily, but his body was not the same. The dog's bony mass lay in a pile of dust, his eyes trying to follow his owner, but there was no longer the same confidence in them. Jerome screamed, but his cry was empty. It was not a cry of pain, but of desperation. He lunged forward, trying to protect his friend, but the cop did not let him pass. "You want more trouble? You think I can't end this right now?" Jackson asked, grabbing his sleeve. He tugged so hard that Jerome almost lost his balance. "You and your dog are the same to me. No one cares who you were, who you are now. You are just a threat." Jerome could no longer remain silent. He felt everything inside him explode. He was ready to go all the way. But so was King. The dog tried to get up again, weak and covered in dust. He crawled towards Jerome, trying to catch his eye, and their eyes met. And in that moment, Jerome understood. He did not need to be afraid for himself. He was afraid only for his friend, for the one who had become his only light in this darkness. He smoothed out his sleeve and looked at King. That look was not just the look of a man at his dog. It was a confession. King was more than just a faithful companion. He was the one who made Jerome feel at least a little alive. He was the one who pulled him out of nightmares, who did not ask, who did not judge. He was a friend, the only friend who was there when no one else was. And now that Jackson was in his way, he knew he would not give up his friend. "You're wrong," Jerome said, gritting his teeth. "If you think this is the end, you don't understand. You just don't understand that I would do anything for him." He approached King, slowly and carefully. The dog tried to stand, but his paws were weak. Jerome carefully picked him up, leaning on him like a last resort. There was the same light in his eyes that had once burned in his chest when he had saved his brothers in arms in Iraq, when he had defended his country. But now it was not his country he was defending. He was defending what was left of him, King. He was not retreating. He was not giving in. He was not going to lose another friend, but Jackson was not going to let him go. He took a step back. "I said go," he shouted, swinging his baton. "Otherwise—" Jerome could not hold back any longer. He looked up, meeting Jackson's gaze. "Or what? Do you really want to do this? Don't you get it? King is all I have left. And if you want to take him, then take me too. Because you can't take my soul. You can't take me. But if you want to destroy him, then you'll destroy everything I have." That look was so powerful that Jackson froze. He didn't know what to do. It wasn't a threat. It was the truth that disarmed him, the truth that made him retreat. Jackson stood there, unmoving, and that moment was more terrifying than any words could have been. Because he realized Jerome wasn't just a man with a dog, he was a fighter, and there was more power in his eyes than in the uniform he wore. Jackson realized it too late. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether you have experienced something similar in your life or have witnessed injustice. Your opinion is important to us. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. And now let's continue. Jerome stood as if he had taken on all the pain in the world for the last time, and now his body could not cope with the weight. He could not feel his legs or his arms, only the heaviness inside him, swallowing him up with each new step towards the endless void, towards what he knew had no end. There was silence all around, but this silence was not empty, it was dull, like that moment when you only hear your own breathing in the night, and it becomes too loud, because all other sounds have simply disappeared. He felt glances that seemed to pierce him like 1,000 needles, because people were standing around him like figures in a painting, but these figures were empty. Their eyes did not say anything. Their lips did not move. All they did was film. He saw phones pop out one by one, their screens starting to record. He heard the clicks of cameras, but no one came. No one moved. Everything that happened was in the mode of observation, like some kind of performance, like a film that someone decided to watch but not interfere with, because something in this action, in this scene, had to remain unchanged. Jerome saw it. He saw, as in the darkest days when he was at war, people standing aside. When he saved his friends, when they died in his arms, when there was so much fear and so little hope in their eyes, people looked and did not believe. When shells exploded right next to him, when his comrade, covered in blood, extended his hand to him, he saw this look, the look of a stranger who does not understand anything and cannot understand. So it was now. The people around looked and said nothing. They did not interfere because it was scary to interfere. They were witnesses, but only witnesses. And Jerome understood that they were not just spectators. They were part of it. Part of the silence. Part of what he carried inside. It was not just anxiety. It was responsibility. It was their fault as well as his. He understood that in his country, in his world, if you were different, you were less than human. You were a black spot that could just be rubbed off the street, vanished from the landscape. All these people didn't see Jerome. They didn't see his pain. They didn't see the medals, the tears, the wars. They just saw a black man with a dog. They saw a threat that had no reason, no value. And that was more powerful than any war he had lived through. Jerome had been through the hell of war, but this was different. It hurt more because he was here, among his own. He was among those who knew what brotherhood was, what service was, what being part of something bigger was. But now he was alone. Alone among hundreds of people who had become his enemies simply because he was different. Jackson continued to look at him with the same contempt that never went away. It was more than just evil. It was just natural. He was a cop. He was upholding the law. But he was the one who was ready to tear apart the person standing in front of him, without any compunction, without realizing that he himself had become part of this system that was destroying everything. Jerome couldn't understand why he tolerated this, why he didn't stand up and say, enough, why he didn't break something. But he knew. It would be like being trapped. That moment when you break down and then you're just drowned, like a drowning man, like someone who can't even scream. There was so much hatred and fear in his eyes that Jerome held himself back. He didn't want to give them this moment. He didn't want to let them label him as the one who attacked. Because they would. They always do. He saw the woman in the suit standing to the side, recording on her phone, and he thought, you're part of this crowd too. They were all part of this, looking away, locking themselves in their own worlds, pretending not to see, not to hear. Jerome had known for a long time that for people like him, this world didn't exist. There were only white walls that would never be destroyed. There were only red zones where they lived, and you just had to be on them. He understood that for these people, he was just a black spot that couldn't be noticed, that just had to disappear, and so he stood among them, holding back his anger. Stood and felt how everything inside him was shrinking. But he couldn't give in. He couldn't give in. He couldn't become what they wanted him to be. This was the last fight, the one he had to win, even if it was pointless. King growled again. A weak but clear growl. He stood there, still ready to protect, ready to meet whoever dared encroach on their only world. Jerome didn't need words. He felt everything that needed to be felt. He turned to King, holding him close, and said quietly, "I'm with you, brother." Those words were for him. He didn't pay attention to the audience. He didn't pay attention to Jackson. He was with King. And that was enough. Only now Jerome realized that for the people here, in this city, it was too much. And he couldn't back out now, because if he did, it would end here. Jerome stood in the shadows, in this park, and everything around him began to blur like a foggy dream. His body was here, but his mind was somewhere else, in another time, where his feet were in the sand and dust and smoke filled his lungs, where there were no civilians above him, only his brothers in arms. He was there again, among them, in Afghanistan. It had started out as another night in the desert, when it seemed there would be no end and no beginning. The burn of heat that penetrated the very core, and the endless silence broken only by footsteps in the sand and the whisper of the radio. Jerome stood at the edge of the position, looking into the darkness, that moment when it can all be over in a second. And when you become so much a part of the night that you forget you're not there. The whole world was just a few kilometers of sand then, hot and heavy, where every step was a risk, and every look a question. And then they came, straight out of the darkness, and everything changed in an instant. He watched as one of his brothers in arms, Will, went down as a bullet tore through his chest. It was like slow motion. Will looked at him as if to say help, but all Jerome had time to do was leap forward, grab his arm, and drag him to cover. Gunfire was ringing out all around him, and Jerome knew they wouldn't make it in time. But he didn't think. He did. All he needed to do at that moment was act. Save someone. They crawled through the sand, and he heard Will whisper something, but something was already becoming unimportant. Will went silent, and Jerome felt his arm become heavy, as if he were holding a rock instead of a person. He dragged him on, despite the heat, despite the blood that seeped from his wounds. He knew his comrade would not survive, but he couldn't stop. He knew that if he didn't pull him now, if he didn't at least save his life, it would be his own fault. Then, as now, standing here in this park, his life depended on one choice. He had saved Will, but he hadn't had time to save himself. By the time they reached shelter, Will had died in his arms. Jerome couldn't remember how long he had sat there in the dark with his dead friend before help had arrived. Time had stopped, and all that was around him was blood and sand and death. He didn't think. He just kept doing what he had to do. He would soon receive a medal for his bravery, but there was nothing in its weight that would bring his comrade back. Will had remained in the desert, and Jerome had returned home to hear only cold words of gratitude. That same year, when he returned to the United States, he was given a medal. It was after a parade. He remembered that moment, with the cameras pointed his way, with the people clapping and shouting, "Thank you for your service." They said it to everyone who had walked this path. And there was something powerless in those words, like they didn't understand that this wasn't just a medal, but memories that couldn't be thrown away. This wasn't just service, it was more. But they didn't know that. And Jerome couldn't explain it to them. He walked down the street and felt how the thanks didn't reach him. How cold and empty they were. How too many words were said but too little meaning was put into them. His life had changed and no one had noticed. In his city, in his neighborhood, he was once again the one who didn't matter. The black veteran who didn't fit into the picture they painted of their perfect, clean streets. After the parade, he found himself back on the street, where he was met with looks filled with suspicion. All he wanted to do was walk on by, without turning around, without looking into those faces, without having to deal with how people stopped looking him in the eye. He heard, "Thank you for your service." But there was nothing in those words. It was like an empty promise they had made to him, as if his service was just another stamp in his passport. The country he had fought for no longer wanted him. He had become a stranger among those who did not know what it was like to be in the desert, did not know what it was like to look into the eyes of a brother in arms who would not return. He had returned, but he was not needed, not accepted. With each passing day, this feeling only grew brighter. He felt his soul peeling away from everything. He was unwanted. Sometimes, standing on his doorstep, he wondered what would happen if he just left, just disappeared, and no one would notice, as if he were just another number, as if he no longer existed. A veteran who was no longer needed. A dog with sad eyes and a collar who had no right to exist because he was different. Jerome was among those who were forgotten. Those who were on the field but not home. A stranger to his country. And the worst part was, he knew it wouldn't stop. It wouldn't go away. He knew it would only get worse in the future, because he was too dark, too real to be accepted, too honest to be forgotten. Everything around them grew quieter. The streets that had been alive just minutes before were suddenly swallowed by darkness. Even the park where they stood, with its stone paths and ancient trees, was silent, as if nature itself had frozen, not daring to interfere with what was happening. Jerome stood, his eyes glued to the ground, but not because he was afraid. He had been in this place too long to be afraid. He knew that any move would be a mistake. He knew that every step, every word was a potential threat to him, and therefore to everything that remained of his human dignity. He felt a cold hand stopping his heart, squeezing his ribcage. But he held himself back. He held himself back from doing what he knew would lead to even greater humiliation, to even greater despair. When Jackson pushed him in the back, he didn't even have time to react. His body was too tired to fight. The fall was inevitable. He didn't have time to catch his balance. And there it was, the asphalt, cold and cruel. He found himself on his knees next to the pitifully whining dog. King was still there. He raised his head, but his body did not obey. The dog was exhausted. His paws were buckling. His gaze was not threatening, only full of despair. His world was collapsing, and Jerome knew. This was not just a fall. This was humiliation. This was a collision with something he could not control. Another step to the very bottom. But this time it was not something to be reconciled with. His hands clenched into fists. Everything inside him was boiling, but his body did not move. He held back his anger. He knew too well how this answer could end. He knew that if now, at this moment, he answered, if he made even the slightest gesture, it would be the last action. He saw it in Jackson's eyes. He could see him holding back a smile, how he was going crazy with Jerome on his knees, how he was enjoying this moment because he felt like he had power now. He wasn't just a cop. He was someone who made you afraid, made you know your role so clearly. "Who the hell are you?" Jackson barked, standing right in front of him, his gaze cold and merciless. "You think you can get through? You think all those medals and your history with people who didn't like you are going to help you here?" He stepped even closer, almost touching Jerome's face. His breath was hot, his voice venomous. "You're nothing more than a common criminal. I'll break you like I broke everyone else who thought they could get by. You think I don't see you? You think you're invisible, a black shadow that everyone forgot to stamp." Jerome clenched his jaw, memories replaying in his head. Everything that had happened, everything he had lived through, had been about one question. Why? Why should he, as a veteran, stand here, on his knees, in this humiliation? Why should he, who had given his body and soul on the battlefield, now be as much an object of hatred as those he had once defended? He knew that if he did not take this step now, if he did not show even a little strength, this scene would be the last he would ever experience. His silence was on the verge of breaking him. But even that silence was a weapon. He could feel King's breathing growing shallower beside him, the way a dog senses the tension, the very edge beyond which the world changes. And then, when Jackson fell silent for a moment, standing right in front of him, with a contempt that made Jerome feel as if his identity had been completely renounced by everything he had ever known, Jerome looked up, not as quickly as he would have liked. Slowly, like someone who knows his words might be his last. He knew no one would intervene. He knew that all that crowd, all those eyes that hardly perceived what was happening as anything more than a performance, would say nothing. He was alone, as always, and King was with him. This was his last excuse. He was there because he believed in him, because he believed that all this could be stopped. "You don't understand," Jerome said, his voice low but firm. "You don't even know what you just did. You broke me, but you won't kill me. And if you think I'm going to stay on my knees, you're wrong." He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how he would get out of this. He didn't know what Jackson would do, but he knew that this was his last straw. He couldn't stay silent. He couldn't stand it. And if it cost him his freedom, at least he knew that at least one part of his soul had not been stolen. Jackson stood, his fists clenched, and for a moment his gaze softened. But only for a moment. He saw that Jerome had not given up. He saw that not only physical pain, but also humiliation could not defeat him. And that was dangerous. Dangerous for someone in shape. It meant that he had to either destroy or break the one standing before him, and he knew that moment would come. But not today. Jerome stood again, slowly, but surely. And now, as he stood, he saw in Jackson's eyes the same anxiety he always felt on the battlefield. When you face someone who was not afraid. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever experienced injustice or a sense of betrayal? Share your experience. Subscribe if you want to continue listening to such stories. And now let's continue. Everything seemed to slow down, inexorably. The air thickened, and each step Jackson took toward Jerome seemed heavier than the last. For a second, Jerome even felt his heart slow down, as if something that had been hanging on the surface for so long was finally beginning to crumble. He looked straight into Jackson's eyes, ready to take another blow, but there was something that kept him from giving in. Pain, anger, but most of all, the knowledge that there was no turning back. He was ready. He was ready to take the blow, standing on his own 2 feet, ready for what was coming next. And then, just as Jackson raised his hand to strike again, something unimaginable caught Jerome's attention. The camera's focus pierced the air. He felt his gaze, which had been struggling to focus on the figure standing behind the cop. She stood there, motionless as a shadow. A woman, in civilian clothes. No sign of alarm, no gesture that might give away her intentions. She simply stood there, silent, watching. She was at the very moment when Jerome could fall, when his entire life could be reduced to one pathetic scene of humiliation. She made no move. She did not scream. She simply watched, but her presence became as important as the fact that this was happening. Jackson did not notice her at first, consumed by his power, his sense of control. Jerome felt his chest tighten. He knew she was there for a reason. He knew she was not simply standing and watching. Everything changed. The air seemed to compress for a moment as she stepped out of the shadows and stepped forward. The woman pulled out a badge, her movement precise, confident, yet calm. The badge read in large letters, Federal Attorney General's Office for Civil Rights. That moment, when everything froze, when attention was focused only on her, seemed as much of a moment of truth as the first time Jerome rose from his knees before his attacker. He heard Jackson turn around sharply, but he couldn't believe his eyes when he saw her. The woman, without losing her calm expression, stepped forward. "Officer Rails." Her voice was firm, authoritative, and there was nothing superfluous in it. "You have violated several federal laws. Stop. Stop right now." In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. Jackson stood there with his mouth open, not understanding what was happening. He couldn't seem to believe that someone dared to interfere. He was ready to grab Jerome by the neck again and finish this. But now everything was different. The woman was in no hurry. She calmly continued to look at Jackson, not giving him a chance to take a break. Jerome felt his breathing become labored, his head starting to spin with excitement. He didn't know what was coming next, didn't know how it would end, but he felt like this was the most important moment of his life. He may not have been ready to defeat Jackson, but in that moment, he knew someone else was ready to step in. Someone who saw what was happening. Someone who wasn't blind, who didn't see him as a threat, but as a man simply trying to survive in this cruel world. Jackson took a few steps back, His eyes filled with both anger and surprise. "What are you doing, woman?" he shouted, raising his hand again but with less confidence. "You don't understand who I am. I am an officer of the law. I protect the streets from people like him." The woman only raised her hand in response, as if pointing him in his place. "You disobeyed orders, Rails," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "You exceeded your authority. You need to stop now, or I will call for backup, and then there will be consequences for you." It all happened so fast that it took Jerome a moment to realize what had just happened. He stood in the shadow of those words, between the cop who was ready to break him and the woman who had stepped forward. And suddenly everything he knew was different. He felt his soul fill with hope again, although this hope was fragile as glass. Not everyone was blind. Not everyone was ready to leave him here, in this hell, with this humiliation. He could still fight. He could still survive. And even though he didn't know what would happen next, even though he didn't know how this situation would end, he knew one thing. His life was no longer just a game of silence. It mattered. Because someone was standing behind him. Someone saw what was happening. At that moment, Jackson froze again. He tried to find something in her gaze, something that could give him back the power, but he didn't find it. He was vulnerable, and the feeling of weakness squeezed him, like the ground was being pulled out from under him. He had not been prepared for this. He had been prepared for resistance, prepared for rage, but not for his power to be challenged by a woman he did not know and who did not fear him. "You cannot stop me," he said, furious. But there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. "I will be judged, Rails," she said, her words leaving no room for doubt. "And you will pay for what you have done." Jerome could only remain silent. He watched as the woman took on the system he had once believed in, and which was now destroying everything he knew. He was just a part of her game. But in that moment, he felt his soul fill with little more than fear. This was a chance, a slight one, but a chance nonetheless. Time seemed to slow down. Everything was happening so fast that Jerome could barely process each new event. The woman with the badge, a federal agent, slowly and confidently presented her identification. Everything she said was short and precise, but her words immediately shattered the moment. Jackson, taken aback, froze for a few seconds, but it was only a second. Everything else began almost immediately. The woman, who had been standing off to the side a moment ago, now took center stage. She pulled out her identification from her bag, quietly said, "I'm with the U.S. Attorney's Office," and her actions became decisive. Jackson froze, as if he realized he was losing control. His gaze became intense, the gaze of someone who suddenly realized he had spun the scene out of his control. She looked at him, and there was no fear in her eyes. This was not just a decision, it was a test. The woman stepped forward and said, "Officer Rails, you're under arrest. For abuse of power, for violating civil rights, and for racist actions." He was arrested on the spot, and this happened at the moment when Jackson seemed ready to take control of the case. But in an instant, all his confidence disappeared. In response to her words, he did not say a word. His face became stony. His body seemed to come alive with tension, but now he could not do anything. When he tried to object, the woman did not hold back. She confidently said, "Enough. You have no right to resist." The words were a blow. The crowd, which had been silent until then, began to come to life. It was like the advent of a catastrophe. People who had just been filming what was happening on their phones began to move. Some got up from their tables. Some walked to the side, pretending that nothing had happened. But this was no longer the same. No longer was the moment when you could just stay in the shadows. This was a flash that everyone saw, but no one intervened. The crowd continued to stand, as if watching a performance. Jerome could see the disbelief in their eyes. It wasn't a belief that anything would change. It was more disappointment. He knew that this scene could be nothing more than a temporary solution. Everyone was sure that these things always get let go. It was in their eyes, the conviction that it would all end like it always did. But Jerome couldn't believe that it would. He didn't know what would happen next, but his heart still beat in hope. Hope was all that was left. And even if it didn't come true, he still felt that something important was happening in this moment. Jackson was trapped. He knew that the system that had been on his side for so long was now against him. The woman with the badge waited silently for the police to arrive. It was a silence in which Jerome felt like his life had finally become important. Important to someone who had seen the truth. He knew this woman was important, but she, like everyone else, could not be sure that justice would work. Jackson did not move. He stood there in the pose of a man who did not know what to do, but his face grew darker. That was the moment when he knew. His time was up. Not now, but soon. Jerome felt torn. He was no longer the man who was ready to fight. He did not know what would happen next, and his body was tense with tension. All he knew was that he had stood. At that moment, the crowd began to feel empty, and all the eyes that turned to Jerome were no longer just observation. They were a test. But someone in that crowd saw more. Someone saw a man who had just broken free from shackles. And as the woman took another step, Jerome felt like he could believe it again. He was on his knees. Not because he was falling, but because he knew someone had heard. But it was in that moment that he realized again that history doesn't always change instantly, even when everything changes. The woman with the badge wasn't smiling. She wasn't happy about what had happened. All she was doing was checking paperwork. All she was doing her job. But in her eyes, Jerome didn't need anything else. He didn't feel the need to make excuses. He felt like he just had to stand, even if he wasn't sure that justice would ultimately prevail. And when he realized that, he felt better. And when all eyes were off Jackson, he felt like it was up to him to react. His anger and despair eased a little, even if it was only for a moment that filled his eyes with confidence. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether you have had something similar in your life or have witnessed injustice. Share your thoughts. Subscribe if you want to continue listening to such stories. And now, let's continue. The next day, everything changed. Jerome woke up to his phone ringing, but it took him a moment to realize what was happening. He barely had time to rub his eyes when he heard his phone vibrating on the table over and over again. He slowly reached for it and immediately knew that something was wrong. Several missed calls appeared on the screen, but one of them was from an unknown number that was bothering him. He didn't know who it was, but inside, he already knew that this was going to be an important moment. He picked up the phone, and the moment he heard the voice on the other end, everything around him seemed to tighten. The voice was calm, even a little distant. But there was something about it that immediately made him feel like this call would change his life. Jerome. Hello. This is an agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have important information, and you need to be prepared for the consequences. He felt a chill run down his skin. This was not something that could be dealt with in a few seconds. This was a challenge that could be his downfall or the turning point of his life. He knew he couldn't take it all back, but his voice didn't waver, and he said, "I'm listening." The agent continued speaking, and every word was like a stone falling into an empty barrel. The racially motivated attack that had just dominated the news was finally making national headlines. His name was no longer just a veteran's name. He was now a symbol of struggle, a symbol of how racism was still deeply rooted in society, how injustice lived in every corner of the country. And now it was more than a personal tragedy. It was a public indictment. Jerome, who had hoped that it would all end by simply fading into the shadows, was now thrust into the spotlight. His story was being told in every corner of the city, and soon across the country. That evening, the news channels began broadcasting footage of his face, the face of a black veteran kneeling before a police officer, humiliated and insulted. He saw the reactions of society, some shouting that he was a hero who deserved respect, others saying that this was just one of many similar cases that could be hushed up and forgotten. But they all saw his face. His fate was now part of this game, which was much bigger than he could have imagined. Over the next few days, he felt the full weight of what was happening. His name was becoming a symbol of the fight against racism, against something that seemed to be inescapable. He was tired of the constant questions, interviews, meetings with journalists who were looking for an image in him, not a person. And then, When the attention was growing, when the world around him was turning upside down, the call came from Washington. Jerome knew that when the president and his cabinet began to pay attention to such things, it was no longer just an accident. It was something he had only dreamed of, but never expected. After that call, the case moved, but not in the way Jerome expected. Suddenly, his face was important not only to local reporters, but to the federal government itself. His name was at the heart of the case, and all he had wanted, to be heard, was now a threat to the system. The following week, Jackson Rales was fired from his job. It was a decision that had seemed inevitable once the case had gone federal. He was under investigation, but in reality, none of it mattered to Jerome. It was too little, too late. Jackson was fired, but his system kept going. Jerome felt his head begin to ache again. He felt that, even now, when he had been given everything he could possibly get, justice and punishment for the cop, nothing was really changing. He was visible, and this was another label bestowed upon him by the country he was fighting for. The city he lived in was engulfed in an even greater storm. Protests began in the streets. Crowds of people seemed to find in his case a source of strength to fight what had been unresolved for so long. There were cries of, "The time has come, the system must be broken." But Jerome felt that this anger was not so much about him. It was more about all those who had been wronged, about those who could not stand and fight like him. And despite the rallies and protests, despite the slogans and cameras, he still felt his place in this world. This was not his fight. It was other people's fight. But his name became something they used. He could not turn away from it. He could not simply disappear. He was a symbol, and this symbol was a tired and worn face that did not ask for it. People in the streets began shouting slogans. All of them were full of fury and righteous anger. But Jerome knew that all this was just part of the circus, a circus that was not his choice, but which he could not stop. And then, as the protests began to gather strength, and the cities began to vibrate with the sound of these cries, he felt that this was the beginning of a new war, but not the one he had seen in the army. This was a war where the winner was not clear in advance. It doesn't matter what we do, he thought. It doesn't matter what we say. We will all still be slaves to what these systems create. King didn't survive. Jerome found out that morning when the animal shelter called him. He wasn't surprised, but something inside him broke, like a crystal glass crashing to the floor, making no sound other than the sound of it crashing. The dog didn't survive the cruelty he had endured. Even if Jerome hadn't been prepared to lose everything, it was the last thread that kept him in this world. It was his last connection to what was still good. And now, it was gone. It was the moment he realized that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he fought, the world would never change. He had been fooled, but not by the world, fooled by himself. He was sitting in his apartment, alone, when the news about King hit him. He was a man who had seen death, who had seen people die, but he had never seen a part of himself die. He thought he could survive anything, but he couldn't. He felt his heart squeeze and his eyes start to fill with tears. Not because he was weak. He simply couldn't bear what had happened. It was humiliating, not just for him, but for all those who had endured the pain and couldn't do anything about it. All that was left was a dull ache that was getting worse. He couldn't find any solace. When he showed up at the press conference, his face was stony. Not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he knew his word meant nothing anymore. He knew this conference was part of the farce, part of the circus, with reporters who wanted to see him hold back his tears, how he fought, how he responded. But what could he say? All he said was what they had all heard, that racism remains, that nothing will change until the system is broken. And that was his only answer. An answer that was not heard, because behind this conference there was silence, a silence that swallowed everything, no matter how much the screams tried to drown it out. Yes, Jerome had been compensated, but he didn't feel it. It wasn't consolation. It wasn't a return of what he had lost. It wasn't justice. It was just an attempt to comfort him, as if it were money that could buy a soul. But Jerome knew nothing could buy a soul, and nothing could take back what he had lost. He stood in front of the reporters, his face stone still, because he didn't believe in change. He didn't believe that his story, or anyone else's, would ever change anything in this system. He knew they would forget. He knew that tomorrow, when everything died down, everything would go back to normal. Jackson might have lost his job, but that was only a temporary fix. The truth was, the system was still there. It was too deep, too strong, to simply disappear. He could see it in the faces of the people around him. They talked about his fight. They supported him. But in reality, they were as blind as everyone else. Justice, if it came too late. And in that moment, Jerome realized that the system was so intertwined with the very fabric of society that fighting it was like trying to fight a shadow. He believed that his actions could change something. But now he saw that no matter how many people showed up at the rallies, no matter how much screaming erupted in the city, it would all fade away as soon as the day was over, and then everything would be eclipsed forever. As the rallies heated up and the streets filled with anger, Jerome felt that he could no longer be a part of it. He could not be a symbol, because symbols often become something bigger than the people themselves, and they lose their individuality. He did not want to be part of this farce, this spectacle they were putting on. He did not want to be a victim. He did not want to be a target. And even when people were shouting his name, when they were demanding change, he still felt like nothing would change for him. He stood there, in the crowd, in the people who believed in the fight, but he knew that their voice was just an echo that would disappear as quickly as it came. Silence always returns, and justice tasted like ashes. He couldn't believe in it anymore. As Jerome walked home after the conference, he felt every step become heavy, not because of the physical pain, but because of what was inside. His faith in the world was fading with each passing day. He knew that everything was lost. Everything was destroyed, and even if he continued to fight, it would only be because he didn't know how to stop. He didn't know how to become a part of this world. Jerome stopped at the window, looking out at the empty street. In that moment, he felt like everything was finished, but he knew that nothing would end, not the way he wanted. The silence. Only that remained. What do you think about this story? Write in the comments if you have ever experienced racism or injustice in your life. Your opinions are very important to us, and we value each of you. Subscribe to our channel if you want to continue listening to such stories, and don't forget to like it if you enjoyed it. Have a nice day. Write a phrase so we know you listened to the end, and leave your feedback. We carefully read every message.